Section 1. History often remembers the freezing temperatures of December 1941 as the moment the German war machine finally seized up outside Moscow. However, a rigorous autopsy of the Oberkommando des Heer, OKH supply ledgers, tells a starkly different story. The defeat was not born in the snow. It was mathematically guaranteed in the planning rooms of Berlin months prior, hidden within the fatal variables of truck ranges, rail gauges, and the inflexible geometry of distance. Now let's open the archives and dissect the system that decided the outcome. To understand the collapse of Operation Barbarossa, we must first strip away the imagery of the Blitzkrieg and view the invasion as a flowchart of mass and energy. The Wehrmacht of 1941 was a tactical entity of unsurpassed lethality, yet it was tethered to a logistical infrastructure that was dangerously fragile. The central nervous system of this invasion was not the Panzer Division, but the supply train. The operational plan relied on a concept known as the Versorgungsbezirk, a supply district fed by railheads, from which truck columns would ferry fuel and ammunition to the advancing spearheads. The critical flaw lay in the assumption of continuous velocity. The German General Staff had calculated that their armies could fight a war of movement for approximately 500 to 600 kilometers before they outran their logistical tail. This 600-kilometer limit was not a guideline. It was a hard mathematical ceiling imposed by the Großtransportraum, GTR. The heavy motorized transport regiments designed to bridge the gap between the railhead and the front line. When we analyze the operational metrics, we see that a standard supply truck of the era, such as the Opel Blitz, had a loaded operational radius that dictated the tempo of the entire army group. As the panzers pushed east, the distance between them and the railheads expanded. Logistics works on a principle of diminishing returns. The further a truck must travel to deliver a ton of fuel, the more fuel it consumes just to make the journey. At a range of 300 miles, approximately 500 kilometers, a supply column begins to eat its own tail, consuming a significant percentage of its payload merely to sustain the transport vehicles themselves. The planners at OKH were aware of this elastic limit. Their spreadsheets accounted for a mandatory operational pause after the initial dash to the Dvina and Dnieper rivers, a period where the tanks would stop, not because of enemy resistance, but because the physics of transport required the rail lines to catch up. However, the friction of war immediately eroded these sterile calculations. The German logistical model was predicated on the rapid conversion of the Soviet railway network. Here, the system of systems encountered a catastrophic compatibility error. European railways operated on a standard gauge of 1/435 millimeters. The Soviet Union, however, utilized a broad gauge of 1/524 millimeters. This difference of merely 89 millimeters was enough to paralyze the entire invasion. German locomotives could not run on Soviet tracks, and Soviet rolling stock was largely evacuated or destroyed by the retreating Red Army. Archival reports from the General Quartiermeister, Quartermaster General, reveal the desperation of this bottleneck. To utilize the captured infrastructure, German railway pioneer battalions had to physically lift the tracks and move the rails inward, or transload millions of tons of supplies by hand from European trains to the few captured Soviet wagons. This process was agonizingly slow. The pre-invasion timeline assumed railheads would advance at a rate of 20 kilometers per day. In reality, during the crucial opening months, they often managed less than half of that. This created a widening supply vacuum between the railheads and the combat units. The motorized GTR regiments were forced to drive double and triple the expected distances to bridge this gap. The operational reach of the army was extending, but the density of supply was plummeting. By July, weeks before the first autumn rains, the leading panzer groups were already reporting hand-to-mouth supply situations. The tanks were winning battles, but the logistical system backing them was rapidly approaching its elastic limit. The planners had assumed a standard consumption rate, but the rough, unpaved Russian roads spiked fuel consumption by 30 to 50%. The system was burning its reserves faster than it could transport them, creating a deficit that no amount of tactical genius could overcome. The mathematical impossibility of the supply limit had been reached, not in the snows of Moscow, but in the dust of the Ukrainian steppe. Section 2. While the rail network struggled to overcome the gauge incompatibility, the burden of the invasion shifted entirely onto the rubber tires of the Wehrmacht's transport fleet. It is here, in the composition of the motor pool, that we uncover the second, fatal systemic fracture. Popular history often visualizes the German army as a monolithic machine of standardized efficiency. Rows of identical Opel Blitz trucks moving in unison. The archival reality, however, reveals a logistical nightmare of staggering complexity. The Wehrmacht did not invade the Soviet Union with a unified transport corps. It invaded with a traveling museum of European automotive engineering, a chaotic collection that defied every principle of industrial standardization. When we analyze the procurement records of 1941, we find that the German army was operating approximately 2,000 different types of vehicles. This figure is not a typo. It is a testament to a catastrophic failure in long-term industrial planning. Unlike the American forces, which would later rely on the standardized durability of the GMC 212-ton truck and the Jeep, or the British with their focused Bedford lines, the German military was scavenging the continent to fill its ranks. Following the fall of France, the Low Countries, and the Balkans, the Wehrmacht aggressively requisitioned civilian and military vehicles to make up for domestic production shortfalls. The result was a logistical Tower of Babel. A single infantry division might possess trucks from Peugeot, Renault, Citroën, Tatra, Skoda, Ford Cologne, and Mercedes-Benz, alongside British Bedfords captured at Dunkirk. While this boosted the total number of hulls on paper, it injected a lethal dose of friction into the supply chain. In the world of systems analysis, standardization is the primary driver of efficiency. Interchangeability allows for streamlined maintenance, predictable fuel consumption, and simplified inventory management. By utilizing a fleet of 2,000 different models, the Wehrmacht effectively successfully multiplied its logistical burden by a factor of thousands. The Beutewagen, or booty vehicle, became the Achilles heel of the transport regiments. Consider the microscopic level of detail required to keep a truck running. Spark plugs, gaskets, pistons, carburetor jets, and tires. In a standardized fleet, a maintenance battalion carries a concentrated stock of compatible parts. If one truck hits a mine, its alternator can salvage another. But in the mixed fleets of Operation Barbarossa, this economy of scale was mathematically impossible. A breakdown of a French Matford truck could not be solved with parts from a German MAN diesel. We see the consequences of this complexity in the daily situation reports sent back to Berlin. As the invasion force pushed deeper into the primitive infrastructure of the East, the abrasive dust of the Ukrainian summer began to chew through engines. Air filters designed for the paved roads of Western Europe were woefully inadequate for the silica-heavy dust of the Russian steppe. Engines wore out in weeks rather than years. When a cylinder head cracked or a transmission failed, the specific replacement part was often hundreds of kilometers away, sitting in a depot in Warsaw or Berlin, if it existed at all. The supply chain for spare parts became paralyzed by its own diversity. The Quartermaster General's office was forced to manage millions of distinct line items, stock-keeping units, rather than a manageable few thousand. A train car arriving at a divisional depot might carry 5 tons of spare parts, but due to the lack of interchangeability, only a fraction of those parts would match the specific vehicles currently broken down in that sector. We see instances in unit war diaries where perfectly intact trucks were abandoned simply because a specific gasket or tire size was unavailable, while crates of useless parts for other models sat unopened nearby. This is the macro impact of micro details in its most devastating form. The strategic offensive halted not by enemy fire, but by the inability to match a screw thread to a bolt. Furthermore, the diversity of the fleet wreaked havoc on the operational tempo through unequal performance metrics. A convoy is only as fast as its slowest vehicle. The high-clearance, rugged German military trucks were forced to reduce their speed to accommodate the lower-clearance, two-wheel drive French civilian trucks that struggled in the soft soil. This friction reduced the daily throughput of the supply lines. Instead of completing 2 round trips between the railhead and the front per day, columns were managing only 1. This 50% reduction in efficiency was not due to a lack of drivers or fuel, but a structural inability to maintain velocity due to mechanical heterogeneity. As the summer turned to autumn and the notorious Rasputitsa, mud season, arrived, this systemic fragility shattered completely. The complex captured vehicles, never designed for such brutal conditions, failed in droves. The maintenance battalions, overwhelmed by the impossibility of their task, ceased trying to repair the foreign vehicles. The practice of cannibalization became rampant, but even that yielded diminishing returns in such a mixed fleet. By November 1941, reports indicate that some panzer divisions had lost up to 60% of their transport tonnage not to enemy action, but to mechanical attrition and the impossibility of repair. The logistical autopsy reveals that the Wehrmacht had effectively walked onto a treadmill. The faster they tried to push supplies forward, the faster their transport capacity disintegrated beneath them. The army was strangling itself, the supply lifeline thinning with every kilometer advanced, choked by the chaotic inefficiency of its own non-standardized design. Section 3. The enduring myth of the Eastern Front is that the Wehrmacht was defeated by General Winter, that the unparalleled German military machine was frozen in its tracks by an act of nature. However, when we correlate the meteorological data with the daily supply reports from the Quartermaster General, a different, more damning reality emerges. The offensive did not freeze to death. It starved to death long before the first thermometer dropped below zero. The systemic collapse was not a climactic event in December, but a gradual, agonizing suffocation that began in late August and solidified in October. By the time the leaves began to turn, the logistical tether we analyzed in Section 1 had snapped. The railheads were still lagging hundreds of kilometers behind the front, and the mongrel truck fleet detailed in Section 2 was decimated by attrition. The consequences were visible in the stoppages of operations reports. In late summer, arguably the most favorable weather for mobile warfare, Army Group Center was forced into a stationary posture for weeks. This was not a strategic choice to catch breath. It was a mandatory halt imposed by empty fuel tanks. The panzers, capable of tactical brilliance, had been reduced to static artillery pillboxes simply because the throughput of fuel had dropped below the daily consumption rate of the division. The archives show that the decision to launch Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, was a gamble made with a bankrupt account. To accumulate the fuel stocks necessary for this last push, the entire supply chain had to undergo a pulse of desperate accumulation, stripping other sectors of resources. When the offensive finally lurched forward in October, it was operating on the absolute margins of viability. The ammunition trains were delayed to prioritize fuel, meaning the artillery support required to break stiffening Soviet resistance was rationed. The elastic limit had been exceeded. When the autumn rains finally arrived, turning the roads into the infamous Rasputitsa mud, it was merely the final nail in a coffin built by logistical negligence. The mud didn't cause the supply failure. It exacerbated a system that was already operating at negative efficiency. Trucks that were previously struggling to deliver fuel now required 3 times the fuel to traverse the mud, delivering a fraction of the payload. The mathematics of energy became inverted. The supply chain was consuming more resources to exist than it was delivering to the combat troops. The verdict of this autopsy is clear. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was not a tactical defeat, nor was it solely a victim of the Russian winter. It was a failure of standardization and a rejection of logistical reality. The German High Command launched a strategic operation that required a supply velocity their infrastructure could not mathematically sustain. They relied on the assumption that the shock of the initial blow would cause the Soviet state to collapse before the supply lines reached their breaking point. When that collapse did not occur within the 600-kilometer window, the war was effectively lost. The army fought on for years, but the strategic outcome had been decided by the gauge of the railways and the incompatibility of the truck fleet. There is a profound silence that sits in the archives of the Quartermaster General. It is the silence of realization that the most dramatic conflicts in human history are rarely decided by the caliber of a cannon or the courage of a soldier, but by the humble, boring uniformity of a screw thread and the unyielding geometry of a supply line. In the end, the system is the weapon, and the weapon is the system.